Buenas. Hello, everyone. First Bermud of the year. Fantastic to be back, to be here in Cinematic Live through our Facebook channel, through our YouTube channel. We are celebrating a couple of programs we started the year with. The one our guest belong to is the Map of Mexican Dreams, which is a collection of six short films we show last night in Glasgow Center for Contemporary Art, and it's going to be available online through our channel in Fest Home. You can get all the details from our website cinematic.com, and it will be live there until the 30th of January. The program, I started saying we had two programs, and this month has been a bit peculiar. We probably were eager to start the year strong, and we challenged China, the whole of China, to a short film war. So each country had to present three short films on the theme of diversity, and I'm so happy we did the event in Edinburgh in the Old St. Paul's Church, our headquarters. The program was amazing, despite two teams working separate, half and half. Once we put it together, it worked like a dream. It was a great sold out. The China won on Best Short Film for Thornberg, very close, followed by Transtierra, our own one. And but Spain won very closely, for a very small margin on overall program. I think it was 55 to 45, something like that. All in all, a great night in Edinburgh, a great way to come back after the long days back. Now the Catalan Film Festival finished at the first half of November or December. So it's been a long stretch to get back in front of people with our programs. Great to see the venues full. Great to have our Fridays in Edinburgh, Saturdays in Glasgow. Great to see Glasgow CCA as well, quite full to capacity. The restrictions are lifted tomorrow, so we had to still live what we have. But it was a great atmosphere. The short films went down so well. And yes, very quickly, we have two guests, and I know at least one of them, I believe, has to take a plane soon. So we showed 6 films yesterday. We were reflecting a bit on communities that retain a contact with the indigenous parts. That came out of a conversation that in Europe, who is indigenous anymore? That it seems that we have lost the old ways. We have forgotten about them to give room for new modern facilities. And we were discussing what we lost in the way. We were saying things like capacity to feed our community without making an impact in our environment and many other things. So it's a reflection that we carry on doing. As you know, a good part of Cinematic is Alberto Valverde. He's traveling Mexico as we speak. I think he's in his last few days and started sending amazing films. And we wanted to, we kind of watch with devotion. And we realized there was a journey from what is a very indigenous, a very mythical story, the one that Fernando Colín Roque tell us with his film Yolotl. My Mayan pronunciation will come to be criticized, but it's the best I can do. To a completely different take on what Mexican communities will be today. You know, Atrapaluz by Kim Torres, which shows a kind of non-binary skate riders, again with a touch, with a connection, with some mythical, some magical, some stuff that is not easy to put in words, is present, but under obviously a contemporary modern view. The program, as I said, took us from over films that touch in this more mythical, indigenous, all original languages of Mexico. We will have the Dr. Itandehui Jansen. I will ask her to let me call her Ita, and her fantastic short film, Time and the Shell, which again reflects on the old, the new, the pass of time, what it remains. It was, say, a great success. I mean, it's good to see that it's taken up online, but it's amazing to see that people are really, yesterday were queuing to see there were any tickets cancellation at the last minute, and we managed to get the capacity to the rim. That CCA Cinema, fantastic. Chris, projectionist, giving it all in with all sort of problems sorted from the screening. This screening as well made me incredibly proud. And I like to mention, I mean, Cinematic is a bunch of people which for different reasons are not showing here today. It's only me. But as you can understand, there's a lot of people behind the scenes. One of them is Eugenie Thuar, and she managed to get all the films that we showed yesterday captioned and properly subtitled, obviously into English, but also captioned for those who have hearing difficulties. So we are very proud of being offering this kind of breaking this barrier to good cinema, to good independent cinema, to those who have hearing difficulties. With that said, I'd like to say two words about Cinematic, and maybe we can start talking to our first guest, Ita, if she's ready. So Cinematic, it's a platform that was set up more than 10 years ago. One day we need to reflect on exactly when was the first event by Cinematic, but nobody wants to do that. So more than 10 years ago, and we have been defending independent cinema, independent Ibero-American cinema in Scotland and beyond. And we do that in a very social conscious way. We try to break any barrier that would prevent people to come to those screenings. And our screenings are very flexible, a social event. Our screenings are costed in a way that people can pay more or less, whatever they can afford. And we do have a commitment for equality, for diversity, for inclusion in our communities. You're welcome to join us in our cinematic.com. You will find links to our Facebook, YouTube, newsletters, Twitters, everything. We have it all. So you choose the social media of your choice and just find us there. We most likely will be there. Well, one of the best things of Cinematic is getting to know amazing people who does amazing things. And I would like to introduce you to the first guest we have today. And I'm going to introduce him. Hello, Fernando. How are you?
Yes. Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. I can hear you. I can hear you great.
Great.
How are you, Fernando? Thank you very much for joining us. Where are you joining us from?
Thanks to you. Sorry?
Where are you joining us from?
I'm here not far from Barcelona right now because I have to go to Madrid. just make a little stop here in the public library. It's called
Okay.
El Moli.
Well, fantastic. Fernando Colín Roque is a director, is a Mexican director. We showed yesterday his short film, Yolotl, which I hope I'm pronouncing something close to what it should be. And it's a film that is in Nahuatl and Mayan. Is that right?
It's Nahuatl, Mayan language, and Tzotzil.
Yeah. Fantastic mythic tale of the Mayan era. There are so many questions about it, but one of the things that caught my eye immediately is you tell a story of mythical dimensions, but you do reflect on the past at many layers. I mean, the contrast between the trees, the ancient trees, and the kids. The language itself is a language that comes across as a language that is much older than others in that area. The trees themselves, they look like these millennial trees that have seen so many things. Is that your intention? Do you mind telling us a bit how you came up with the idea for this short film?
Yes, thank you. First of all, thanks to Jaime here. I'm so happy to speak about Yolotl. First of all, this film, I wasn't pretend to make a film. I was I was trying to make an installation, some installation. Actually, before everything, it was just like music and birds and that. And that's the first time I tried to make a non-narrative film. I wanted to make an experiment with like a hybrid format with documentary, animation, with everything. I wanted to mix everything in a magic tale. And what's really happening with that is that also I wrote. Can you hear me? Because I saw that something is just like making that. Can you hear me? Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I can hear you perfectly, and it's fine.
Okay, right. So I just wanted to make this this film about trees because I was at that moment very connected with a tale that my grandma told me. This tale was a Mayan tale also that explains how the Seiba is the connection between the sky and the human beings. So I wanted to describe this mythology, and I make my own version. I think so. How do I arrive there? I just wanted to learn more, and I just wanted to open my my ears because the very first exercise I did with this film is just like walking into the forest. Obviously, I was supported by a Mexican NGO called Sur Verde. So I was in the Mayan rainforest, and was just like a very. I just wanted to I'm gonna mix languages maybe because
No, and I was
I live
actually,
in France and yeah.
no, because sometimes when we are traveling, it's more difficult. If you prefer to move to Spanish, it's fine, and then we will put some subtitles.
Okay. I think it's good.
Habla usted en español,
If
hombre.
you're okay with that. Ok, bueno. Entonces lo que te decía es que intentaba con esta película, sobre todo hacer una película inmersiva. Una película inmersiva que intentara al mismo tiempo ser un híbrido, porque como te decía desde un principio, quería hacer una instalación y esta instalación me llevó a explorar varios formatos, documentales, ficción y formatos incluso de animación. En la dimensión del lenguaje, eh, es un lenguaje que mi abuela me enseñó, el náhuatl. Es un lenguaje que me fue transmitido y de ese modo quise también hacer un homenaje a la diversidad del país, de México, y a esta manera mágica de México mágico, ¿no? De concebir el mundo, ¿no? Quería hacer también mi propia versión de un mito antiguo maya, de la ceiba. Este mito maya cuenta la conexión entre el cielo y la tierra y cómo al mismo tiempo es importante tener otras visiones, ¿no? Que sean, como se llama, non-human point of view. Also. Y esto es lo que quería experimentar con Jonathan.
Bueno, pues desde luego lo consigues introducir al espectador en un ambiente mágico, en una realidad diferente a la que estamos y conectamos. Hay una leyenda maya y tú tienes que entender que yo soy un europeo de estos así cabezón del siglo pasado. Entonces, claro, me han inflado la cabeza con todo tipo de cosas que luego a lo largo de mi vida voy viendo cuáles son reales y cuáles no lo son. Pero había una leyenda que me interesaba muchísimo de los pueblos mayas, de que ellos podían hablar, comunicarse a grandes distancias a través de los árboles. Y luego eso, pues claro que conecta un poco con el tema de las setas, ¿no? del micelio, de la red de comunicación que va debajo de todo lo que es nuestra naturaleza y que ha aprendido tantas cosas a lo largo de millones de años, ¿no? Bueno, la observación que tú haces de esos árboles milenarios también, o centenarios, los vemos hasta por debajo. Hay un momento en que se suben esas ramas, se llenan de colores y nosotros ya estamos en un mundo totalmente mágico que aquí en Europa lo hubiésemos puesto arriba, ¿no? Lo mágico está arriba y miramos desde allí. Porque claro, nuestras culturas, pero en tu caso, estamos en el micelio, estamos con lo que tiene toda la información primigénica, original del planeta Tierra. Y no puedo, igual me dices, Rafa, ¿qué estás contándome? Pero yo quería saber si tú has reflexionado sobre este tema, sobre el hecho de la parte más mágica de tu corto, es esa visión desde abajo.
Sí, gracias por decirlo también, Rafa, porque creo que es importante, pienso, en un momento eh, en donde, es importante hablar de nuevas narrativas, pero sobre todo de hablar de, vamos a decirlo, de nuevos puntos de vista y puntos de vista forzosamente no humanos, ¿no? Y creo que los árboles, las aves y los champiñones tienen muchísimas cosas tenemos muchísimas cosas que aprender de ellos, ¿no? Y que apenas estamos empezando a estar a la escucha, desde luego con el corazón abierto, pero también racionalizando ciertas cosas que de pronto en una visión muy reducida humana no logramos comprender, ¿no? Porque a veces así somos tercos, ¿no? Y creo que los champiñones han estado antes que nosotros, como los árboles. Incluso eh, hay una, hay una, hay una bióloga que se llama Lynn Margulis que habla sobre la teoría de la simbiogénesis, donde ella explica que la evolución de los organismos ocurren a través de un trabajo en cooperación y no en competencia. ¿Te suena esto?
Sí, sí,
Nosotros
sí.
decidimos hacer un proceso, decidimos hacer un proceso de competencia entre nosotros y las otras especies que habitan el planeta. Y desde luego, los champiñones y los árboles ya trabajaban en cooperaciones, por eso que han podido evolucionar, ¿no? Entonces, esta teoría evolutiva también nos explica eso y lo vemos con muchísimos ejemplos, ¿no? La micorriza, las micorrizas, me parece que se llama en español, que es esta simbiosis entre el micelium y los árboles, ¿no? Que logra, sin duda, eh,
Sí. Y que es el nivel
dibujar
con el que...
bosques, paisajes, por supuesto. Y creo que las especies siempre han trabajado de manera, las especies han trabajado de manera cooperativa y necesitamos aprender mucho eso ahora, ¿no? Sobre todo en momentos actuales post-pandémicos, necesitamos ser más resilientes y la resiliencia también se aprende desde los champiñones y desde los árboles, ¿no? Entonces, este homenaje a los árboles también es un homenaje al reino vegetal y al reino fungi, ¿no? Y es curioso que lo menciones porque, bueno, estoy también trabajando en una temática sobre los champiñones, es el tema de la siguiente película. Entonces, todo va conectado.
Que gracias. Yo soy, bueno, esto no tiene nada que ver con el cine, pero mi pareja y yo somos locos del micelio, de la micología, y vamos por las tierras escocesas buscando todo esto. Pero bueno, y me sorprendió mucho ayer verlo. Me hablas de otras razas como de una manera muy original o muy diferente a lo que conozco yo, o lo que conocemos por aquí, de árboles, de setas, de que sean otras razas. Siguiendo con el micelio ayuda a que esta vida florezca en el planeta y la vida humana por recesión también está influenciada. Los mamíferos evolucionamos compitiendo con el micelio y nuestra temperatura sube para que el micelio no pueda entrar. O sea que también estamos influenciados por él. Pero no, vamos a mover un poquito, vamos a volver un poquito al lado del cine. He perdido la onda de lo que estaba diciendo. Los árboles, el detalle que tienes tú de esta historia, hay una relación entre ellos, como una historia de amor entre los árboles, y es increíble, me gusta muchísimo cómo vas a la textura de los mismos y cómo encuentras esas diferencias para distinguirlos. Y luego el contraste tan maravilloso con unos árboles que ya parecen, como digo, centenarios, como sabios, ¿no? La, la edad pues trae sabiduría, ¿no? Sabe más el diablo por viejo que por diablo. Y, y de repente buscas el contraste, la paradoja, los chavales jugando, el nacimiento de ese chico que sale de su jersey o de su chaqueta. Que a donde quiero llegar es, hay una reflexión en Europa, que yo creo que también es compartida por otros países, en lo que se llama el mundo desarrollado, entre comillas, que hemos perdido en el camino de este desarrollo, ¿no? Y una de las cosas que hemos perdido, pues por supuesto, son nuestra cultura indígena, nuestras culturas originales. Hay una idea que puede ser equivocadísima también de que partes de América, de Sudamérica, pues han conseguido mantener más esas culturas originales, manera de vivir indígena de otros días, y que las nuevas tecnologías y las nuevas cosas tienen que convivir con esto, más que reemplazarlo. ¿Tú crees que eso es cierto? Y podríamos hablar un poco de qué crees que perdemos cuando desconectamos con nuestro pasado de esta manera.
Sí, creo que es una reflexión importante, ¿no? Lo que acabas de decir y creo que de cierto modo siempre me parece que sin duda nos hemos desconectado. O sea, yo tiene hace 8 años que vivo en Europa y, y, y pienso que también en México ha habido tanto bueno, países como México, en países como Francia, donde está mi residencia, también hay cierta desconexión, pero es en el modelo más de ciudades donde existe esta desconexión con seres humanos, ¿no? Es decir, eh, hemos olvidado que estamos relacionados con las otras especies, ¿no? Nos hemos olvidado de las otras especies. Hemos adoptado una visión antropocéntrica y la visión antropocéntrica sin duda ha limitado también una especie de florecimiento que podemos tener también como como especie, ¿no? Porque, por ejemplo, yo te quiero responder también con un ejemplo muy concreto. Yo vivo en el bosque, mi casa está en el bosque y hemos tomado la decisión de vivir en el bosque porque creemos que nos ayuda a florecer, ¿no? Me siento mucho mejor viviendo en el bosque ahora que de cuando vivía en la ciudad, ¿no? Por ejemplo. Y creo que me recuerdo, por ejemplo, esto me hace también pensar en cosas que, que me contaba mi abuela sobre la importancia de cómo se vivía antes, de que antes conocíamos cómo funcionaban las temporadas, hablo de las temporadas de la lluvia, las temporadas cíclicas, sabíamos cómo funcionaba la luna, sabíamos cómo funcionaban las estrellas y sabíamos también cómo funcionaban las plantas y los animales. Lo que pasa es que ahora nos hemos aislado de todo este conocimiento por un choix, por una elección, pues fue una elección. Pero también tenemos la elección de poder reconectar con ese conocimiento, ¿no? Y yo creo que, regresando un poco como al tema de México y todo este mix de culturas, porque la realidad es que en México hay muchísimas culturas, ¿no? Y eso hace que sea muy diverso también, como el approach, ¿no? El aproximarse a ciertas cosas. Y, y el lenguaje también puede ayudar, el lenguaje también te puede ayudar a abrir ciertas maneras de percibir el mundo, ¿no? Y de percibir el universo, pero sobre todo de percibir y cuestionarse cuál es la plaza, cuál es el lugar que ocupa el ser humano en el universo, ¿no? Entonces, siempre cuando uno hace unas reflexiones hacia cómo las otras especies habitan el mundo, uno también hace su propia reflexión hacia cómo estamos habitando este mundo.
Sí, muchas gracias. Bueno, en este corto, en Yolotl, tenemos un poco de esta reflexión. Habéis que me dejó súper impactado ayer. Lo había visto ya con Alberto y cuando elegimos todo esto, pero fue verlo en pantalla grande ayer que me dejó blanco, vamos. Y el tema es que tú también, o sea, eres director, escribes, como dices antes, el proceso empieza antes de que eso fuese siquiera una película, sino... Y luego también eres el director de fotografía, que es una parte que me gustaría tocar contigo luego en esta entrevista. O sea, lo tienes todo en este corto. Te lo tuviste que pasar de maravilla, ¿no? Esas tomas que estábamos hablando antes de los árboles iluminados, coloreados desde abajo y todo lo demás. Pero tú te gusta más trabajar así, es un concepto tuyo, desarrollarlo y un equipo más reducido, o estás preparando cosas con más gente, con equipos más estándar de cine. ¿Cómo lo tienes?
Sí. Bueno, por ejemplo, generalmente trabajo así. Trabajo así porque también es una cuestión práctica, pero también es una cuestión, digamos, de choix, ¿no? Trabajar con equipos reducidos. Esta película éramos solamente 4 personas, 3 personas en la selva, pero el proceso de preproducción eh, ocurrió, bueno, con el proceso de escritura, pero escritura de música, porque estaba escribiendo la pieza para esta, para esta película antes de hacer la película. Y después escribí el texto, que es el cuento que escuchamos en náhuatl, que está narrado por mi voz. Y bueno, ya después las etapas de producción de película. El montaje generalmente no lo hago yo porque me hago muchas bolas y prefiero también tener una visión externa. Pero en el próximo proyecto que estamos trabajando, que terminé de trabajar el mismo año, que es un largometraje, que también se sitúa en México, también lo hemos trabajado con equipo reducido. Donc, pues ese es un poco, no sé si respondí tu pregunta.
Sí, sí, sí. Bueno, es la
Sí,
facultad.
generalmente. Sí, y por ejemplo, aquí lo que me gustó mucho de esta película fue que pude involucrarme en todas las etapas, e incluso en la animación, porque la animación también la hice. Estuve muy contento de hacerla, eh, porque digamos que quería entender también, a veces para poder abrir hay que cerrar. Y en este sentido, eh, quería hacer este proceso en mucho silencio, ¿no? En mucha meditación y en mucha autoexploración, porque finalmente estaba recibiendo un aprendizaje, ¿no? De los maestros, de los árboles, de los milenarios. Entonces, estaba muchísimo a la escucha y cuando a veces estás mucho a la escucha, a veces puede ser muy enredado hablar. Entonces, decidí durante todo este proceso de realización, sí, que fueron como un año, ¿no? De trabajo, estar realmente en un proceso de muchísimo silencio, muchísima escucha. Escucha y silencio, este fue el proceso. Bueno,
Qué maravilla, es una forma preciosa, ¿no? De hacer esta película. La película es la consecuencia de una experiencia vital, ¿no? Que tuviste allí en esa zona. Bueno,
sin duda,
Luis,
sin duda.
perdona. No sé, perdona, que quieres decir algo. Como director de fotografía también he visto que tienes un par de... Bueno, has sacado dos cosas este año. Tienes The Whisper of the Wolf, los suspiros los susurros del lobo, como director de fotografía. Y
Sí,
también tienes como director La vida es un carnaval, que todavía no he conseguido verla.
así es. Sí. Oh, qué bueno. Pues mira, sí, están ahí. Well, Whisper fue una película, nos fue bien en ITFA, en Ámsterdam, ganó un premio ahí importante, y estamos contentos y le está yendo bien. Me gusta la imagen, me gustó trabajar mucho con los lobos, trabajar con la directora, Chloe Velo, que en esta película de Yolotl, pues también hice la foto, desde luego, y, pues me gusta mucho trabajar en la fotografía, es mi pasión, y hacer las imágenes. Après, luego hay una consecuencia que, por ejemplo, en el trabajo con los niños, habla de Yolotl, ¿no? Y el trabajo que tuvimos en la selva, fue muy bonito porque los niños que estaban ahí todo el tiempo, eh, estábamos aprendiendo juntos, ¿no? Ellos me enseñaban a estar más sensible y yo les enseñaba un poco de usar la cámara, por ejemplo. Entonces hay unas tomas que estaban haciendo los niños. Bueno, yo pienso que después voy a editar ese material que los niños hicieron para poder hacer otra pequeñita pieza, ¿no? Entonces, no, creo que todo el compartir que se pueda, toda la manera que se pueda hacer a partir de compartir es bienvenida. Bueno,
Totalmente. Y bueno, nos contabas antes que estabas trabajando, bueno, mirando a ver más tema de naturaleza a través de las setas. ¿Nos puedes contar un poquito más qué trabajos, en qué estás trabajando?
sí,
¿Qué es lo próximo que vas a hacer tuyo?
sí. Puntualmente ahora el trabajo es un trabajo estamos en desarrollo de una película. El tagline de la película es Do Plants Have Consciousness? Queremos hablar de la conciencia de las plantas y de cómo también pueden enseñarnos mucho, ¿no? Pero desde un punto de vista más, vamos, no sé cómo podría describirlo, pero queremos poner en escena, te cuento esto, es eh, una especie de trial, de juicio que se hizo para justamente saber si las plantas tenían conciencia o no, y de ser así, otorgarles este estatus de dignidad y entonces de protección en la ley. Y creo que puede ser interesante. esto es una ley que ya está, por ejemplo, trabajada en Suiza, la han empezado a trabajar, recientemente se está discutiendo en varios parlamentos, no muchos, pero queremos hablar de la conciencia de las plantas, ¿no? Desde un punto de vista legal y si realmente la conciencia de las plantas puede también abrirnos otros horizontes. Y por otro lado, trabajo en una película sobre los champiñones porque en mi casa, tu casa, como se dice en México, eh, montamos un laboratorio de producción de champiñones. Nos interesa mucho, cómo crece el shiitake, cómo crece el reishi y el lion's mane. Y lo estamos haciendo en las cavas, unas cavas que recuperamos. Y bueno, estamos haciendo también cultura en logs de robles en español. Y bueno, estamos inoculando unos robles.
Bueno,
Voilà.
suena maravilloso, Fernando. Me gustaría muchísimo invitarte a que vinieses a Escocia a presentar tu corto y la próxima película. Y si eso ocurre, aparte de las pintas que nos vamos a beber, te quisiera
Por
llevar
favor.
a un bosque escocés y encontrar chanterelles, que son las que más nos gustan aquí.
Wow.
Son las que no se pueden cultivar, no se pueden. Hay muchas otras que sí, pero esas en particular no se pueden producir más que en la naturaleza.
Sí, chanterelles bellísimas. Bueno,
Sí, 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 sí. Pues yo sé dónde están.
ya
Oye,
me llevarás, Rafa.
totalmente prometido. Mira, es un placer hablar contigo. Como te digo, ayer tu corto ahí en el CCA en Glasgow gustó muchísimo y estamos muy pendientes de tus próximos cortos. Estoy deseando a ver si encuentro donde verlo de La vida es un carnaval, pero ya lo encontraré. Y, en fin, te deseo muchísima suerte en todo y que tengas un buen día en Madrid. ¡Qué suerte!
Gracias. Gracias por el tiempo, la entrevista y la invitación. Y espero poderlos encontrar próximamente. Tlazocamati, como decimos en náhuatl, que es gracias.
No, pues,
Tlazocamati.
Mati, a ti. Hasta luego. Muchas gracias.
Venga, chao.
Bueno, pues un placer hablar con Fernando Colín Roque. Ya sabéis que su corto Yolotl está disponible online en FestHome. I'm still speaking Spanish, I'm sorry. We tend to speak in Spanish in these interviews and then have an interpreter, but sometimes we need to move to the mother tongue, which is a bit easier to express certain things. And I hope we will subtitle, obviously, Fernando's interview. And I was saying in Spanish that you can still watch his amazing short film called Yolotl in FestHome. Get all the details from cinematic.com, get all the details from our website. And without much ado, I'm really looking forward to speaking with Ethan Dehui Jansen, the director of The Time on the Shell. Hola, ¿cómo estamos?
Hola, ¿me escuchan?
Hola. Sí.
Is it finally working? Are we going to speak Spanish or English?
Whatever you feel better with.
I'm fine with both.
Yes, but if you want, maybe we can carry on in English, and if you need
That's
to
fine.
say something in Spanish or move to Spanish, we'll do it, because this is your house.
Okay.
So well, it's very nice to see your film yesterday. To thank you very much for joining us. Ethan Dehui is a doctor, is a teacher in the university, is a filmmaker. And the film we were showing yesterday, which I'm not going to even attempt to pronounce in its original title, the one in English is Time and the Seashell. And it's a beautiful reflection on the pass of time, the difficult thing to represent on image, or the pass of time, what I guess everything evolves with the time, but different things do it at different rhythm. And the contrast between the seashell, the sea itself, and the boy that becomes a man and eventually moves on in life is such a strong image. How can you explain us a bit about your film and how did you come up with it? Where you start thinking about making it?
Yes, it were two different ideas that we merged together. I tend to work together with my husband, who appears in the film as the man, and he's Mixtec from Mexico. And we visited his community, and he noticed that a lot of the biodiversity, or a lot of the animal species that he had seen when he was a child in his community, had disappeared or were no longer there or had severely diminished. So he was worried this was the consequence of climate change. And I had been wanting to make a film for a very long time about a boy listening to a seashell, but I didn't have a story for it. I just had this one image in mind that I thought, this is beautiful, I want to do something with this. But I didn't know what else to do with it. So we brought those two ideas together. He had been writing poetry in Mixtec about the landscape, and I thought, well, maybe we can combine that written poetry, or spoken poetry in the end, with poetic images of the same place. And little by little we started thinking about this idea that because our son and my husband look very much alike, it might be nice to make a story about a man looking back to the past, which is what he was doing anyway, and at the same time thinking about a boy looking forward to the future, which is what worried me, in the sense that if we are going, if we're continuing to destroy our natural habitat, then what will be left of it for our children? So I think we combined these two ideas and these two concerns into one film.
But the result is fantastic, and it's such a poetic way to put it. Speaking with you, then I discover even more layers of information about it that I didn't even think about before. I was talking before with Fernando. I don't know if you've seen his beautiful film, Yolotl, and I was asking him about this vision, this of what we call the developed world and the ways we live, and how we lost a bit contact with our indigenous people, the old ways of living. In particular, in Europe, that is the case. It's difficult to point on who is actually still living in the old ways. It seems that nobody, everything changed, very recent, and it changes again and again. And there's a reflection on what we lost when we evolve in that way. Looking at your films, obviously, and others from everywhere outside Europe, you get this idea, this connection. I mean, in Fernando's film, he's talking to the trees, he's talking to nature. In yours, it's the same. You see the evolution of a boy into man, but you are as well on the beach, or you get to see. What is this something you consider in your film, or your other films when you're doing your documentaries?
That is a very complicated question. Of course, to begin with, indigenous peoples, as defined by the Working Group on Indigenous Peoples by the United Nations, are peoples who remain or continue to live in a situation of colonization. So it's not necessarily the case that all indigenous peoples maintain a traditional or an ancient or a more original or even more natural way of living. It's often the case, but it's not what defines indigenous peoples. The reason there are no indigenous peoples in Europe, except for maybe the Scots and some, the Roma and maybe others, is that Europe has not been colonized. So the definition for indigenous peoples are peoples who continue to live in a state of colonization. So if you think about the Native Americans in the United States became independent of Britain but the native people in the United States didn't get any position of power within their own territories or countries, except for these very little pieces of land that were called, or are continued to be called, reservations. And on those reservations, some native tribes have decided to build casinos. So there is a strange tension between, let's say, development and economic access and traditional way of living. And I don't think that all indigenous individuals in Mexico necessarily want to maintain a traditional way of living. I think a lot of people actually would like to have access to internet and to hospitals and to electricity and to roads and to all kinds of comforts that in Europe we take for granted, but that in Mexico are, for example, not accessible to indigenous communities. And that's not because they don't want them, it's because the government has decided that they don't need them, or that it's too much money to spend on these communities. So there is a question of marginalization that isn't necessarily voluntary, isn't something that has to do with culture, but is the effect of, in Mexico, in different countries it's for different reasons, but in Mexico, basically the government forgot about indigenous communities. So indigenous communities don't have hospitals. And if you don't have hospitals, then you need to continue to rely on your traditional medicine, because there is no other medicine that you have access to. But that's not necessarily always the best. And I think that a lot of traditional healers and a lot of people who live in traditional communities would agree that the best would be to have the best of both worlds, to have access to both traditional medicine and to keep that alive, but to also have access to a hospital when really needed, because there are things that traditional medicine might not be able to resolve. So there is a tension there that I think it's important to not romanticize the life in indigenous communities or to think of them as only traditional, because, for example, in particularly the United States, there are a lot of indigenous people who live in cities. And the truth is that I myself and my husband, who is indigenous, he grew up in an indigenous community and speaks a native language and is in touch with his community. We live in a city in Europe. So, but that does not make us less indigenous in a way. So I think it's important to keep that in mind, that it's not that indigenous people necessarily are in touch with older traditions. And if they are, it's not necessarily the case that that's entirely because they want to, but sometimes it's also the consequence of necessity. I do think that in general, there have been different studies also by the United Nations that a lot of indigenous communities do continue to guard or to take care of their environment in ways that, let's say, nations don't always do. Because if you live off the land and if you need to fish in order to find your meals, then you're also more respectful of that environment. There is a direct link quite often between your livelihood and the environment. And if that's the case, then you need to be more careful of not destroying that environment. And it's also true that a lot of, let's say, in the case of Mexico, there are a lot of state projects, whether they're about sustainable energy or oil or, let's say, construction projects that harm those environments where indigenous communities are living. So there is a lot of tension between, let's say, the government and indigenous communities because of mining activities, construction activities, hydro dam activities. So that often that's very common, I think, for a lot of indigenous communities, not only in Mexico, but also in Peru and even in the United States, that communities have a livelihood that depends on the natural environment, and the state, on the other hand, sees it as a way to make money. And then those interests there, of course, clash. But it's not straightforward. It's not a simple, it's not easy to say, well, all indigenous peoples care about the environment, or that's very, very different to Europe. I think it's much more complicated than that.
It sounds like it is, no? The minute you get maybe some modern facilities, you may start a process of slowly forgetting about the old ways, which probably is what happened in Europe, that people wouldn't know how to go to nature to cure anything whatsoever.
No, that is of course true. And I think it basically has to do with urbanization. No, as soon as you have big cities, and you start buying your vegetables in the supermarket instead of growing them yourself, then they're
plastic bags. Yeah.
and you think they always come in plastic. Yes, that is something that happens. Then how do you teach your children to still understand what the natural environment is? Yeah.
Well, at least giving them access to good films, amongst many other things that show this. In your other films, probably your short films are the more fiction ones. You are, correct me if I'm wrong, predominantly a documentarist, and then
No.
you.
I
No.
have mainly made fictional films. I have one documentary called El Rebozo de mi Madre, and most of my other films are fiction.
Yes, I was going to say that the short films were really more fiction ones, but still you don't leave that as it happens in current filmmaking, the line between what is a fiction film or a documentary is just not so clear, not so well defined. And in your filming, that happens as well. You preserve language that belongs to fiction or to documentary and mix it to please your film, to please yourself.
I think it's mainly, to be very honest, a budgetary concern. So I think I started with documentary. I studied documentary first and then moved to fiction. And I've worked a lot with non-professional actors. That was not so much because of budget, but because of language. A lot of my films have been made in Mixtec. That has been important for me, but there are no trained actors in Mixtec, or not a lot. So I ended up quite often working with people who spoke the language, but who were not professional actors. And then I tend to work with very little additional light. So a lot of my films are shot with available light, quite often outside, outdoors, on existing locations, basically because of, let's say they're all smaller budget films. And I think there's also a question there of wanting to be true to the places that I want to portray. So a lot of my films are set in indigenous communities, and it would be, I think, strange to change those environments or to try to recreate them. So I often shoot or film in communities, and then try to not glamorize things by adding a lot of lights and changing it in that way. So it has a very documentary feel, but most of them have been fictional stories that have been staged with non-professional actors on existing locations. So I think that's where the mix of both feels sort of hybrid, but they're mainly fictional stories told through documentary tools in a way.
It's interesting how you mix different reasons to choose how the elements of your films. Some budgetary obviously will come into equation, but also your interest for certain communities in certain places, but obviously implies that you have to use maybe non-professional directors, actors. Excuse me. You also mentioned, I mean, some of the. This is a question that comes from one of our colleagues, Eugenie Theuer. We touch about the marginalization of the indigenous communities and how that can be something that maybe influence the film you want to make, the movie you want to make, to stop perpetuating this marginalization, to kind of let the development or the cause and evolution of those communities go in an organic way. Is that any influence in your films as well?
I guess so, in the sense that my mother is Mixtec. She is from an indigenous community, and we visited quite often when I was a child. and I felt quite a big split because we lived in the Netherlands, so I felt quite a big split between my life in the Netherlands and, let's say, my mother's life in the community, or life in my mother's community. So I didn't really recognize any stories or any films or any books or anything that would help me navigate these two different worlds. So I think that when I started making film became a tool to try to, on one hand, keep the connection with my community alive, because of course I'm very far away. So one way to continue to be part of my community is making films about that community. It also became a way to find a way to navigate that split myself. So a lot of the films are actually about characters who live in two worlds, or it's a contrast between, let's say, an urban environment and a more rural environment. So quite often I've been trying to tell stories about, let's say, that contrast and that difference in worlds. I think particularly Alma y Esperanza, which is a fictional film about a young girl traveling to a community after her mother dies, and Tiempo de Lluvia, or In Times of Rain, is a feature-length film about a boy who lives in a small community but is going to go live with his mother in Mexico City. Those are films that are very much about this contrast between urban city environment and a rural environment in an indigenous community.
That's so interesting. Well, we read the announcement, I think it was just Friday, something like that you were working on a new project about a warrior woman from the 12th century. I think it's called a story of Mixtec Princess in Osaka. Can you talk about this new project yet, or
It's very early, so I can say that I'm working on the project, and I can give a very brief summary of what it is about, but I can't tell you a lot more because it's really still in development. I'm writing it together with Armando Bautista Garcia, who is, again, my husband and longtime collaborator. It's a film set in the 12th century, and it is loosely inspired on characters that appear in Codex. It's a Mixtec book, a pictorial book. Mixtec people used to write by drawing. So they drew stories on something that looks very much like a book. And this Codex happens to be in the collection of the British Museum. So it is inspired by characters that appear in this codex, and the story in the codex is set in the 12th century. So we wanted, and a murder takes place. So all the characters that are going to appear in the film exist or existed probably in real life, and they have names and they have, let's say, their story told in this book. But because the interpretation is not entirely complete, it gives us a lot of creative license to think about what exactly happened. One of the things that we know is that a murder happens. The father of this woman was murdered 15 years before she rises to power, and we decided to craft a story where she tries to find out who committed the murder. So it's really a detective story, and we're currently writing it, and we hope to be, but that's something you never know in film, to be filming it in 2023 or 2024.
That sounds like amazing, no? Like a Mesoamerican 12th century thriller. I'm up for that, no problem.
That's exactly what it's supposed to be, a 12th century Mesoamerican thriller. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for joining us on a Sunday afternoon. Thank you very much for your films, for letting us have this time on the seashell. And I would like really to keep in touch, since we are all living in the same city.
Thank you.
And well, good luck. I think the title that this publication suggested, it was the Flint City, Ciudad de Pedernales. I'm so intrigued with this.
I'll keep you updated. Thank you so much for the invitation, and I really, I'm really happy that you're organizing these screenings, and also the accessibility that is part of Cinematic. I didn't know that, so I'm really excited about that, and I hope lots of people come and watch the films online as well. And it's good to hear that in Glasgow there was a good screening, because it's been such a long time since we've been able to, go to the cinema.
Yes. That is amazing, and it was a great night yesterday. It was a
Great.
queue of people waiting for cancellation, so it was
Wow.
full. Yeah, and
Great.
we hope this is the beginning of the going back to something.
Of going back. No, that's great. Well, thank you very much, and have a lovely evening.
You too. Thank you very much, Ethan. Have a good evening. Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Well, so that was Ethan De Huy Jansen, the director of The Time and the Seashell. That was our last guest today. I'd like to thank her, and to thank Fernando as well for joining us. And remind you that the Cinematic has this online program where you can watch both Fernando's, Ethan De Huy's, and over 4 films all the way till Sunday. We have a sliding ticketing system, so you pay what you can, and you can watch it as many times as you want, and it will be live in Fest Home until the 30th of January. All details in our website, cinematic.com, or looking at this message that I've been sent by probably Anna Feducina, who is behind the comments. I know Evgeny Thuer has been sending me stuff as well. Alberto is trying, but Alberto Valverde, but certainly he was behind the lion's share of the programming for this month. And well, thank you to all the Cinematicas, to the people who came on Friday to the Chinese Challenge, the people who came yesterday to watch this map of Mexican Dreams program, and to everyone supporting us. Thank you very much. Remember, we are back in February. We are on every month. And if I remember well, I'm talking off memory, please check our website. But it's the 12th of February in Glasgow CCA, and the 18th of February in Edinburgh's Old St. Paul's Church. We have our now traditional another love, a different take on Valentine's stories. Come and see, come and enjoy, come and share, and it's great to see you always. Have a good month, and see you soon. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.